I was saying thank you for joining me during your lunch hour. My stomach was growling in the last presentation, so I'm sure you're hungry because I am. But we'll try to make this quick. So as I was presented, my name is Jennifer Wong. I'm a product engineer at Envoy, and you can see by the photos that I really love animals. You can find some social media here in case you want to tag me or look up some of my terrible code. And just a note about Envoy is that we're hiring. We hire remote engineers all around the world. So if you're interested, definitely come talk to me afterwards. So to get started, we're talking about empathetic design systems. So what is a design system? How many people know what a design system is? Raise your hand. And then keep your hands raised if you have worked on a design system before. Okay, so it's a pretty small percentage, maybe about 10% of the crowd. So just to get started, I'm here to tell you that design systems are super trendy right now. They're so cool, and you should get into them. But what I was thinking was, when did design systems get started, and how did they get popular? And the way that I found out was I just looked up what atomic design was, and that term was first coined by Brad Frost in 2013. So I'm thinking maybe that's when design systems got started. But actually, I did a little bit more research and found that there's actually a design system, and this was an exhibit at one of your museums here in Moscow. And so there's a design system in the USSR, and that was created actually on April 28th in 1962. So maybe you all in Russia are actually ahead of the curve. But this design system was primarily for mechanical and industrial design. So we're talking about web design, which is totally different. So UXPin says that a design system is a complete set of design standards, documentations, and principles along with a toolkit, typically made of UI patterns and code components, to achieve those design standards. So you may have heard also other terms for a design system, such as a pattern library, component library, or a style guide, but a design system is actually typically composed of all three of these things. So Rose by any other name is probably just a design system. So a pattern library is a set of design patterns for use across an entire company. So those patterns may be UI patterns and how you organize components on a page. A component library is a set of commonly used elements for use across the entire company. So those may be smaller components that are used inside of those UI patterns, such as buttons or inputs and forms. And then lastly, a style guide is static documentation that describes the design system itself. So it talks about how products should look and feel, use cases for those UI patterns we spoke about earlier, correct typographic scales, colors, etc. So now that we know generally what a design system is, let's take a look at some design systems. The first I'd like to point out is called Spectrum. Spectrum is created by Adobe. And the first time I heard of Spectrum was during a conference called Forward.js, and a woman named Sarah Fetterman presented about Adobe. So you see here is a screenshot of every single iteration of a button across all of Adobe's products and services. So it's a lot of buttons. You have a lot of options here, which is pretty crazy. And it makes sense because Spectrum is huge, because Adobe is huge. It's a huge company, and they have an entire team dedicated just to working on Spectrum. Another interesting thing I discovered is that Spectrum is actually private, so it's just created for Adobe. It's not open sourced, and so I kind of stole this screenshot from them, but don't tell them. The next is the US Web Design System, and that is created by 18F. 18F is a consultancy that lives inside of our General Services Administration in the US. So basically, they create products and services for the dozens of government agencies that exist in the United States. So the US Web Design System is open source, which again makes sense because it's the government and the government serves the people. So it should exist as open source. And you see here their iterations of buttons, which are much less than those in Spectrum, which again also makes sense because you want some standardization across all of the government services because they are serving so many people. Next is a style guide I found on Mozilla's site, which I thought was pretty interesting because I discovered it hadn't been updated in over a year. And I was like, that's odd. Mozilla is like a very popular website and service. How could they not have updated their style guide in so long? So I was like, maybe this was a side project or a Hack Week project, and maybe it didn't get enough support. I don't really know. And so I dug a little bit further, and actually there is another style guide called Photon, and this is for Mozilla's Firefox. And again, this one is open source, and it was updated just a couple of months ago. So I think this is actually the primary one, but it's kind of interesting to see that there's this like web legacy of design systems on the intranet for Mozilla. So those are some design systems, and we're going to talk about empathetic design systems. So how many people know what empathy is? Raise your hand. And how many people know what it is because they went to Maurizio's talk earlier today? Raise your hand. So when I went to Google, I read that empathy is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And we can see that empathy comes from the Greek words em and pathos, which means to be in feeling. And beneath that, I found on Google that there's this kind of tracking of a chart of the popularity and usage of the word empathy. And you can see that it's gone up in the past 60 years or so, which is pretty interesting. So design systems are trendy and empathy is trendy. So let's put them together, kind of like these patches on a jacket. So UXPin, which is a collaborative design platform that does prototyping and systems-based software, ran this survey called the Enterprise UX Industry Report. So they surveyed about 3,000 or over 3,000 people who were primarily designers, but also included developers. And they wanted to know information about their UX process. So one of the questions they asked were, what challenges do you currently face in your UX process? And I noticed as I was reading these that many of these challenges actually dealt with empathy. So one is like improving UX consistency, and that's empathy towards your users. The next was testing designs with users, and then of course that again is empathy with your users. The next is clarifying requirements, which is empathy between your product manager and your designers and your developers. Also, there's collaborating between teams, so that's empathy between teams and your coworkers on the same team. Getting buy-in and understanding from your executives. So how do your executives understand what you are trying to create? And then also handing off designs to developers. So that, of course, is empathy between your designers and developers. So teamwork, empathy is really described as teamwork, and many of these challenges have to do with empathy related to that. So what is like teamwork? It's like working together, basically, and really trying to understand each other and help each other out. So I actually started out as a civil engineer, and I was an engineer that worked with architects. And that relationship is very similar to working as an engineer with designers. And before, what we used to do was called over-the-wall design, where a designer would create designs or an architect would create designs and throw them over the wall to an engineer, and that engineer never actually talked to the designer or the architect. And so we're trying to break that wall down so that you can actually talk to the people that you're working with and empathize with them. So a company where I used to work, we had a design system that was created at my time there. And why did we want to create a design system? Well, we wanted to be part of the future. So going back to this question of what challenges did we face in the UX process, we were actually trying to solve very similar issues. The first of which is, I'm sorry, I can't read this, improving UX consistency. The next was our collaboration between teams, specifically between our design and development team. And then also dealing with legacy technology. So with the popularity of React, some of our engineers had decided that they wanted to move from Backbone to React. And so that meant replacing our old style guide and then starting to move into React. And so when did this happen? This actually happened during our company rebrand, which was part of our UX consistency. And then again, replacing our old legacy technology of our style guide and then Backbone. But actually, primarily, a lot of people were working on this for popularity. So when you create a design system, a lot of people think about public relations, like when can we open source our design system? How can we write blog posts or be on conference panels or give presentations like this one? And there were some individuals at our company that were looking to boost their careers by being the force behind this design system. So none of these reasons were empathetic towards anyone at the company or any of our users. So our motivation for creating the design system was flawed from the start. So again, originally we were trying to have this company rebrand and focus on exploration of our brand. And this was typically driven by our design team in branding. And the design system had a team behind it that was built of our front-end foundry team in engineering. So that consisted of 3 of our most senior front-end engineers and then 3 entry-level engineers who had just moved out of boot camps. 1 product manager who was originally a design manager, so he understood the intricacies in design. And then pretty much our entire design team, which was up to 15 designers at any given time. So our style guide, just a bit about that. It's very old school. We actually built it on KSS, which stands for Denial Style Sheets, SCSS, and CSS. So KSS is essentially auto-generated style guide documentation created with HTML and CSS. But you can see here it was last updated in 2016, so it was really time to move on from it. Other reasons, this is what the structure looked like. So you can see the documentation here in comments in our CSS and below that CSS. So issues with the style guide was that it was very brittle. There was no systematic way for us to add new features or styles. The cascade in CSS often meant that styles overrode each other in unpredictable ways. And the common styles sectioning required a lot of manual effort. So going back to this code, we can see here there are some buttons called bright buttons, and there's no real documentation on what a bright button is or what it's supposed to look like. Next, you can see here modifier classes. So these modifier classes just get automatically added by KSS, but because of the cascade, there's no way to predict what's going to overwrite what. And then lastly, you see our style guide sections. And these are the sections that sometimes when you added things, you actually had to go in and manually change every single section within that larger section. So it was time for something shiny and new, which is our design system. Nathan Curtis says that a style guide is an artifact of the design process, whereas a design system is a living, funded product with a roadmap and backlog, serving an ecosystem. And that was the case for us because we had an entire team dedicated to our design system, whereas our style guide was just kind of created willy-nilly and everyone could input whatever they wanted. So some things that we got right with our design system. The first thing that we did was we created a component generator, and this was created using plop.js, which creates a boilerplate of code files. So here's a GIF of how that works. So you can run it, and you're creating a component here, which we're going to call Snazzy Time. And then once we do that, we decide if we want it to be under foundation, atoms, molecules, or organisms based on atomic design. And then that just creates an entire, a bunch of different files, including an example, a different page, a README for documentation, UI tests, unit tests, component.js, and then also component Sass. So that gives a very structured way of adding a component. Additionally, we did a great job with documentation. So it may be a little bit hard to see here, but this is our docs folder. And in our docs folder, we have information on how to get started, how to add new components, information on atomic design, and more. So it was a good way for people to onboard to the design system. The next thing we did was we created what's called a planned approach, or a structured way of adding new components. And what that meant was that we sat down with the front-end Foundry team and then decided for each component what props were needed, when will it be used, what will it look like, and we made sure to plan ahead and have a structured way of adding those new components. The next thing that we got right was accessibility. So we really thought about accessibility more than we had in the past. The first thing that we did was we started using ESLint plugin, JSX-ally, and that basically like lints all of your code to make sure that it's accessible as far as the linter can tell. So things like checking for color contrast, making sure that your inputs have labels, etc. Another good thing we did was we made sure that our modals were accessible, and modals are notoriously hard to get right with accessibility, so we really made sure we focused on that. So those are some of the things we did right, but there were a lot of things we did wrong, and those things were typically caused by a lack of empathy. So the first thing that you usually do when you go to design system is you're searching. You're probably trying to find a component, but you don't know what you don't know. And what do I mean by that? Well, I don't know what a component with like a little arrow pointing down that you click on and it shows a bunch of options. I don't really know what that's called, so how do I know what to search for? Maybe it's called a drop-down. Or maybe it's called a drop-down menu. I'm not really sure based on looking at this. Another interesting thing is that we can see that both drop-down and drop-down menu are underneath the category called drop-down. So I'm like, what is the drop-down underneath the drop-down called then? I don't understand what the difference is. And related to that, naming things is hard. So again, we can see that drop-down is underneath drop-down, as is drop-down menu, but I don't really know what the difference between any of those things are. Another issue that we had with naming was that our design system was originally called eDesign System, but it was formerly called Black Panda. So in lots of places around the code and then in our continuous integration, it was called Black Panda. And so if you were coming to the design system for the first time, you're like, I don't know where to find information about this. What is Black Panda? But what is EDS? And then also EDS is an acronym. So what does that even stand for? A lot of people didn't know. Another issue we had was trying to tell if something was deprecated. Is it deprecated? Maybe. I don't know. So this is an example of a deprecated component. It's called a card list. And what it says here at the top in this banner is that component is unstable and subject to change. But what does unstable mean? And what does subject to change mean? Does that mean that I can use it once it's changed? Or is it deprecated? It's very hard for me to tell. And where can I find more information about that? And here's another deprecation issue that we ran into on my feature team. So we actually were using this thing called a text input, which is basically an input in a form. Unfortunately, we didn't know that our design team had planned to create this other input called an input field. And so once we found that out, we had to spend the time to create the input field, stretching out our roadmap and delaying the feature that we were trying to release. Another issue we ran into was like component confusion. When and where do I use a specific type of component? So again, coming back to the dropdown, you see here a dropdown menu, a select, and also a select field. So presumably, if you look at all of these, they all have an arrow pointing downward, and we assume that by hovering over one or clicking on one, that would show a list of options. But they all look almost exactly the same, so how do I know which one to use at any specific point in time? There's no information about this here. And again, naming is hard. So we have the drop-down menu, the input fields, and the select, and then the select field is actually part of the input field, not part of the select. So that's also confusing. And then I also have this image of what I call a mountain lion here, but in the United States, some people call it a puma, some people call it a cougar, and apparently some people call it a mountain screamer as well. Another issue we had was that it was very hard to find CSS. So how can our designers contribute to our design system if they can't find CSS? You see here that we have a button, but inside of this button, we just see some React code and JavaScript code. And unfortunately, the learning curve for React is kind of steep. So if a designer comes here and they're like, I just want to edit some CSS, where do I find that and how do I change it? They can't find it. And then if they go into the code, they can find the CSS, but inside of the CSS file, you can see there are lots of imports. And so they have to move around all of these different files in order to discover where the CSS is that they want to edit. The next issue we saw was with our grid system and alignment. So our grid system actually used inline block, whereas our alignment styles used flexbox. And of course, those conflict with each other. So some of the unknown effects that we saw was with this widely shared new component, it was created and used by many people. So I actually used it in one of my features, and I was like, I know how the grid system and alignment classes should work, so I'm just going to change around all of these styles to make them work correctly, because the alignment classes should sit inside of the grid system. Unfortunately, by me doing that, I just changed everyone else's features, and everyone was like, what is going on with the alignment here? And I was like, oh, it's my fault. So there was a cause and effect that happened because of what I did. So the cause that happened was, again, this conflict between the inline block and the flexbox. So it was a miscommunication of how the grid system and the alignment classes worked. And use of both conflicted, and editing those classes messed up everyone else's use of the component. Another issue we saw was with our release process. So this is how our release process went. Frontend Foundry released a new version of our design system once a week. So that's once a week, which isn't too bad. But then we also had to wait for the new design system to be bumped as a new version in our core repository. So that just delayed everything. And interestingly, our Frontend Foundry team was one of the few teams that didn't use the design system in production. So the feature teams were always like, we're just waiting on Frontend Foundry to get stuff done. So again, coming back to the question of what challenges do you face in your UX process? We did a really good job of replacing our legacy technology and replacing our style guide. Also, we did a decent job of improving UX consistency across our code base, but the collaboration between our teams was lacking. So some solutions that we found are empathy. The first thing that we wanted to do was try to create a better search with better discoverability. So unfortunately, with my time at this company, I didn't actually see any of these things implemented, but these were the plans that were drawn out. So eventually, what they wanted to do was create a better search and better discoverability by having a smaller navigation bar, being able to search across the entire code base instead of just for the name of a component, and then having a homepage of screenshots of each component so that was easily searchable visually. We wanted to make naming things easier. So no more code names or acronyms. Eventually, the plan was to purge the code base of anything called Black Panda. Try to remember that new people coming to the design system don't know what Black Panda is. And when they don't understand what that is, make sure you explain to them what that legacy name meant. The next thing that was really important to us was communication, making sure you don't hoard information like Cookie Monster hoards cookies. So the first thing we did was create a front-end guild that spanned across all different feature teams. So we had weekly meetings, and then we also created a design system Slack channel where you could come to ask any questions about the design system. The next thing we did was make sure that we talked a lot about the difference between the grid system and the alignment classes, and that was actually part of one of our front-end guild meetings. And then lastly, again, talking about the difference between the text input versus an input field, and making sure that designers let engineers know when it was going to be deprecated or when they had a new component in mind before the feature was being created. And then lastly, like having component clarity, so having usage guidelines around each of the components when you should use one at any given time. And those were eventually to be created by our designers. Another thing we were thinking about was using React and how do you introduce designers to React. So there are a couple of ways to do that. One way I found on the internet is called React Studio. So basically a designer can create a component and then it spits out React for them. So this is another image of React Studio just spitting out the React code. And then another website is called, or another application is called Framer, which does a very similar thing. And then the last solution that we found to one of our issues was our release process. So you see here we have better documentation on our release process and when it happens. And then also we created this bot that tells someone when it's their turn to bump the newest version of design system in our core repository. So it was being more inclusive of the people and engineers around us. So what should you do when you're creating a design system? You should definitely empathize. Try to think about who's going to use it. Is it designers, product managers, engineers, QA engineers, marketing, or maybe external stakeholders if you decide to open source your design system? Make sure that things aren't just on a need-to-know basis and that you share your information deeply and widely across the company. Write the docs. Build a great search and then have a centralized place to see what components have been designed, which ones have been built, which ones have modifications, and then which ones are going to be deprecated or already have been deprecated. Mozilla has a really good example of this. They have an entire page dedicated just to deprecated and obsolete features. Have a process on how to make things work. So have a step-by-step guide in describing how someone can get started using your design system. Or better yet, create multiple ways for each of your user types. So some helpful tools in this process. One is Storybook, which is a UI development environment, and that can help you get started in creating a design system, should you choose. It's open source, and it comes more from an engineer's perspective. There's also UXPin, which is the UX design platform, which ran that survey I mentioned earlier, and this one comes more from the designer's perspective. I also have just like a stock photo here because Maurizio had mentioned Alva, which is created by Sinotrader, and I learned about it today. So that is similar to both Framer and React Studio in that you can create something with a design and it spits out your component in code. And then just to close, I want to talk a little about what we do at Envoy. So this is our design team. We're missing one person who is our content strategist who just started. But for our design team, it's really important that we have open communication. So they have group critiques all the time. They talk about their designs constantly. They have dedicated hours where they meet because some of our designers are remote as well. It's also important that we have low ego on our design team. So that means that when you have a group critique, you're not so attached to your design that you're insulted when someone has contributions. You assume that those contributions are well-intentioned and to make your component or designs better. You can read more about our design team at envoy.design, where they write about all of this information. So I met with Wells Riley, who's up in the middle with the glasses, and I asked him, he's our VP of design, and I asked him, are we planning to build a design system? And he said, if you want to build a design system, start with one component. And then I said, well, do we need a design system? And he said, if you have to ask that question, you don't need a design system. So what are design systems good for then? Absolutely nothing? No, I'm kidding. So as I mentioned earlier, they can be good for things like public relations and marketing, especially if you're going to write blog posts or open source your design system or give presentations about your design system. They can also be really good for career building and like really moving the company forward together in one direction. But don't forget, there is pain and suffering along the way, as I talked about earlier. So questions you should ask yourself before you get started. Do you have the resources? Because remember, we had an entire engineering team of 6. We had 1 product manager and almost our entire design team, which was 15 designers at any given time. That's 22 people. Our Envoy design team, by contrast, is 1 design manager, 1 content strategist, and 5 designers. That's just 7 people. And they would be the ones to get this design system started. So that's less than 1/3 of what we had at the company where I used to work. And Envoy is still small. We're about 90 people, whereas the company where I used to work was close to 800. Another thing to remember is build what you need. Because if you build ahead of your needs, you usually end up with a component you don't need, or a component that doesn't meet your current needs, or a component that has extra features that maybe you don't need right now. And it often can't account for all of the edge cases that you might see. So say you want to automate putting ketchup on your burger or your hot dog, but you're not quite ready for that yet. You might end up with something like this. You've got this ketchup machine that has these extra arms that you don't need, and then you don't account for the edge case that it's going to get ketchup on the edge of your plate. So that's what happens when you build ahead of your needs. So remember, as I talked about earlier, we had the text input and the input fields. So we created this text input, but we built ahead of our needs. And so all of the work that went into creating the text input was replaced by all of the work that was used to create the input fields. So at Envoy, we think about first things first, which is our component library. That's just step 1 for us. So you see here in abstract, which is essentially Git for designers, that our designers have created our libraries, which are for having components created that are shared across the company. And then you see here inside of the libraries, we have these symbols. So these are the symbols that will be used across all of our designs and eventually across all of our platforms as well. So that's just getting started with our component library. And we just want to solve one problem at a time. So one problem that we had was with our icons. So just imagine that this guy in the middle is icons, and all of us engineers and designers are all the guys around him falling over. So we just wanted one solution to one problem that a lot of us had. So in our past workflow at Envoy, we could see that there are lots of different icons. These are just the icons that have the word arrow in them. And so I take a look at them and I'm like, well, I don't know if that's the right one or not. So there are lots of different icons with different names saved in different places. So the way that you would find an icon originally was to maybe go to the code in a file like this, which is our assets and images. And if you can't find it there, maybe you go to Sketch if you have access to Sketch and look for it there. And then if you can't find it there, maybe you ask Amy, who's one of our visual designers in charge of creating new icons. Unfortunately, by doing that, that means that only Amy can find the correct icon, and only she has the power to create a new icon or export it for us. Another problem we saw with icons is that there was an issue of naming things again. So some of our icons were called X, or close, or cross. And then how do you discover which one is right? Or are they all exactly the same? So let's empathize it. We had one of our engineers, Ryan, and one of our designers, who I mentioned earlier, Amy. They decided for Hack Week to create an icon library. And this is what it looks like. So you can just go to this page, you have all of the icons in front of you, and as you click on an icon, you have different options that pop up that are related to this icon. So we have sparkles here, and then you can see I can choose it as a two-tone, but two-tone is only available in black and red, for example. And this icon library is going to be used by our product managers, our designers, and our engineers whenever they need access to icons. And that was just one small thing that we tried to create during Hack Week. So by having this icon library, we have empathy for Amy, who is our main designer for these things, any designer, any engineer, and any content creator who might come across icons that they need to use. So again, like having teamwork and then having engineering and design go hand in hand. So in conclusion, I like to say, do as I say and not as I do, because the company where we worked, we didn't do as great of a job of empathizing. So I'm telling you to empathize with your coworkers across different departments, teammates, and then also all of your users and people who may use your design system in the future. We didn't do a great job of it before, but learn from all of our mistakes. And then if you're still a small company, try to start from the scratch, start from one step at a time. So do as Envoy does. Basically, remember to build what you need and what your team needs. Start with a small component library, only when your team actually has the time, and then solve one problem at a time, preferably a problem that lots of people have. So some resources here. I'll put up these slides at some point. And that's all I have for you. Spasiba.
See? I'm not a liar. Best speakers. Yep. So, now be serious. Only your questions stay between me and food. It's dangerous. So, up
also
your
me
hands,
and food.
or I do it myself. Nice. Smart decision.
Thank you for your talk. And I want to ask you, as for me, I doing bad things not because I'm a bad person. Like I make a text field when input text exists, but because I don't have enough time, and release date will be tomorrow. No, yesterday. What should I do if I do not have much time?
So for me, I often spend the time talking to my manager. It takes a little bit of extra time to kind of describe why you need the extra time. And it really requires you to think in the future. So you say, yes, it may take extra time right now, but in the future, it'll save time for this many people. So I think for me, personally at least, getting buy-in from both my manager and then from my teammates, so maybe my product manager or from the designers and other engineers, and talking to them about how to spread the load a little bit to save time is the way that I usually discuss it.
Thanks a lot. It's correct.
Someone?
Hi Jennifer, thanks for your talk. It was interesting, yeah. And I have the feeling that creating the design system is a kind of shift of responsibility to build the visual styles and visual things to the engineers, from designers to engineers, yeah. And do you feel that is it correct?
So I don't think there's one correct way or incorrect way, but I guess this entire talk is about empathy. So maybe it's not correct, but it does help everyone in the end. Maybe it helps your designers because you're empathizing more as an engineer with how things should look, or making sure everything is pixel perfect. And then from the flip side, as I described, this kind of having this type of design system does require your designers to dig into code. And so that allows your designers to empathize with engineers. So if they design something that's hard to engineer, maybe they understand a little bit better why it's hard to engineer, and maybe they decide to come up with a different solution. I don't know if it's correct because I think it's something you can do without a design system.
Yes, we can do a lot of things without design system, like creating CLI tools and working with command lines only without any visual stuff. And so, if we know that engineers are not good at creating visual stuff and creating design system for them, I don't think that helps much because that kind of blocks you have to have the feeling and ability to create something visual nice from existing blocks. If you give the numbers of buttons and so on and selectors and kind of inputs to the engineer, I'm not sure that everybody can create something visually nice from those blocks. Blocks are nice, but the results maybe not nice.
Yeah.
And design system couldn't solve all the problem.
Yeah, I think that's correct. And so for us, we definitely still had our designers create overall design patterns. So what an entire page should look like.
Kind of widgets,
exactly. So part of the design system was the UI patterns that I had mentioned earlier. So making sure that your designers create a pattern. So yeah, you have one input, but you need to know what an entire form should look like. And then if you have different sizes, then you need to have information on that. Or maybe you have different devices that you use that on as well. So considering mobile is something that is required of designers as well as engineers.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning this. This is very important, actually. This is more important than creating just styles for buttons and text fields. You need to create the whole visual style of the page, of the block, of the kind of forms in different conditions. Yeah, thank you.
Ребята, если у кого-то кто-то не хочет позориться своим английским, вы можете говорить по-русски, пусть все просто покекают над моим, я постараюсь перевести. Someone? And what do you mean when you say that you don't have time for this? Come on, you have 8 hours work day. Why you do not want to spend 7 of them for supporting style guide, you lazy puppies? Come on, we have a cool books for best questions. Okay, if you do not want, you can catch Jennifer later on discussion zone and ask later. So, can you choose the best question, best of the best?
That's hard because there's only 2.
Just choose me.
Okay. I'll choose a question about is it correct to have a design system?
Woo! Applause.
But also, I have some notebooks for the gentleman who asked a question about time. Some Envoy notebooks, if he'd like. I cheated a little bit. I have swag.
Мы можем так сделать? Что? Oh, okay. Where's your notebooks?
They're in here.
Okay, you have a lot of them.
Yeah, it's a whole pack. So.
Oh. All of this to the
Yes.
handbook?
Yes.
So, applause again. Так, кто задавал вопрос? Руку поднимите. Ага. Хорошо. So, food waiting for us. So, final applause for Jennifer.
Thank you.
Oh, I forget a very important thing. So, here for you.
Thank you.
Little thing and a cup.
Cool. Thank you so much.
We have pretty cold in Russia, so you can use it for tea. Or not.
Okay,
So.
спасибо.